Hello and welcome to the Recovering Therapist. Today we're going to talk about coping strategies. In the last videos we've been focusing on what does our recovery platform look like. And so we're going to move from the clinical side of developing and building that recovery platform, and we're going to start integrating some of the practical tools that we can identify, build, and grow with as far as coping strategies and supporting our recovery platform. So to start, I want to talk a little bit about how do we manage some of that fear that can creep in regards to relapse and early recovery. I think it's always kind of in the back of our mind. We hear people talk about, well, relapse is part of recovery, and it can be, but it doesn't have to be. And I think sometimes that can lead us to be a little hesitant and fearful about how are we going to manage this, and am I doing the right thing? I'm always reminded of courage, and courage is not about having no fear. It's really about how do I learn to master my fear. So I'm not making decisions and choices based off fear, but I'm actually making them based off of what's in my best interest and incorporating what I call those codes of conduct and living by those, as opposed to making those choices out of fear. Because what I know for me is that whenever I made those choices out of fear, typically they didn't really end too well for me. Once I've kind of started to incorporate some of these codes of conduct, rules of the road, spiritual principles, and I started to live by those, I knew that my choices were a lot more solid. Let's talk about regulation and acceptance. And it's about how do I manage those emotional spikes? Because we're going to have them. There are going to be times throughout our life, not just with early recovery or middle recovery or long-term recovery. There's always going to be emotional spikes. And part of being able to address those is learning the acceptance of these spikes, and whether that's cravings, that they're going to be there, and not to get freaked out about it and not act out on them, but to learn how to manage these moments when I do have these heightened emotional pieces, right? We've talked about the OHALTs and those kind of things, but in addition to that, some of those practical tools that we can do are obviously taking that moment and starting to do some of those breathing exercises. Because typically what we know is that if I'm able to do that deep belly breathing where I'm breathing down into my stomach as opposed to those short breaths, but actually breathing and then releasing, that when I'm able to do those deep breathings, typically those can't coincide with stress. So if I can take the moment and start to do some of those deep breathing techniques, those will help with some of those emotional spikes. The other thing we've discussed before, and I will reiterate, is those grounding techniques, about being able to just bring myself back to the present moment and making sure that I'm grounded with my reality and what's really going on. A lot of times with fear, what I can do, and generally fear is what drives a lot of these emotional spikes. So what I can do in those moments is typically just ground myself. If I'm fearful, generally it's about something I'm afraid of in the future, or I'm fearful of some shame from the past, and being able to just kind of get back into that moment and be in that moment and accept that moment can be instrumental in being able to, what I would call, ride that wave out. And this is kind of the concept of dealing with an acceptance of emotional regulation is riding the wave. So we know that a wave will start out, and then it'll begin to grow and grow and grow, and eventually it will crash, and then it will go back to normal. And that's kind of how our emotions are. Although at times it feels like they may never stop, they will. Eventually, we're going to go back to that emotional state that we were in prior to having these heightened emotional moments. We're not trying to cure our feelings. The feelings are always going to be there. It's not about curing them. It's really about just accepting them, understanding that, yes, it's part of being human. It's part of who I am. Feelings are not facts, as they say. They're just feelings, and nobody really dies from feelings, although, again, sometimes it may feel that way. And then there's the physiological component to coping strategies, and again, it's that 5 p.m. rescue. What am I doing that I'm setting myself up so when I have those cravings or when I have those urges at 5 p.m., I'm taking steps with different coping strategies, whether that's making sure I'm hydrated, making sure I'm going to a meeting, I'm eating, some of those halt things. The psychological component to coping strategies is really that self-care stuff that we've talked about in the past. Again, taking care of myself in those ways that I'm setting my day, that I'm checking in with myself and checking my emotional levels. And then at the end of, when I get home, making sure that I've got a plan in place that I'm going to get through and be consistent with those things. Ideally, at the end of the night, I've got those good sleep hygiene components put into place. So I'm letting myself know, okay, it's time to go to bed, and here's how we're going to start that whole process. Lastly, I'll talk about connection and structure. Really, we have to kind of redefine fun. What is fun for us? Because for the longest time, what I thought was fun was just sitting around getting drunk. And what I came to realize is that's not necessarily the case. When I worked in an adolescent treatment center a long time ago, and I remember there was a therapist there, and one of the clients would come in and they would say, I'm bored. And his comment to them was, that's because you're boring. And I think that really reflected back on me. When I got bored, it was because I was boring. I hadn't gone out and started to explore those kinds of things that I would find joy in and that I would find challenge in. So that's part of the recovery, is going out, exploring, and redefining my fun. It's building those relationships with people in recovery. So I have that kind of new architecture of what my fun's going to be about. Giving yourself a little bit of grace during this transition. And it's really just kind of a place of exploration. Go out, make those connections, look for that structure. And all of this stuff, again, we're looking at kind of the discipline of it. I know I keep coming back to that, but really is, if I can get to that discipline place where I start to implement these things instead of allowing my brain to tell me how much drinking is going to be great, it doesn't give my brain time to do that. I'm too busy doing some of these other things. So keeping occupied obviously becomes a key to this as we start looking at coping strategies. I want to transition to kind of some just general common coping strategies as we work through this. We'll talk about external triggers first. So those are those things that are going out in the world that are kind of outside of our own thought processes. Initially, there's something that's triggering me from outside. And generally, we look at 4 coping strategies to address those external triggers. The first is to avoid. Again, I don't necessarily want to put myself in those high-risk situations where I know in the past they've led me to drinking. So I avoid those things that may trigger me. An example of this may be I change the way I drive home because I used to drive a certain way, and I knew that was where the beer store was or the liquor store was or my dealer was. And so now I take a completely different way, and I basically avoid that opportunity for that relapse trigger to take place. And that's a pretty effective coping strategy. The second's going to be to escape. You're in this stressful situation. What do I need to do? Well, I need to get out of it as quickly as I can. Again, kind of being aware with all of these, we need to have plans in place. We don't want to wait until we're in the midst of them before we've ever thought about, well, what do I do if this situation occurs? Part of it is planning ahead. So again, if I know that I'm maybe going to some sort of party where there's going to be drinking involved, or going to some sort of meeting, or going to some sort of work-related function where I know alcohol is going to be involved, I need to have a strategy that if I need to pull the chute and escape, that I have that already laid out before I even walk in the doors for that. Again, some of those things may be that I take my own vehicle, so I know that I've got car keys. If it's time to leave, that I can walk. Also, having a spouse there or a support system, a friend there who is aware of what's going on, that when it comes time and that starts happening, that I can kind of give them the signal and they can come over and support me and help me transition out of that situation, whatever that may be, whether that's just giving somebody, helping me say goodnight to everybody or whatever that is. But having that plan in place that when it's time to go and I'm feeling that urge, I don't need to sit there and tempt it. I don't need to see, let me see if I can ride this out. No, there's no shame in that. Just pull the trigger or just pull the chute and go. The next external is going to be distract. And with distraction, typically urges won't last real long. So what I want to try to do is distract myself until they dissipate. Again, one of my favorite coping strategies early on when I would feel those urges, I would go try to find a big box store where, I could just go roam around for a while. And by the end of it, any idea or thought about drinking had gone away. Whether, it's just walking around Costco, Sam's, Walmart, Home Depot, Lowe's, whatever, just walking around looking at things, getting my mind off of this idea that I really want to drink. So what can I do to distract myself? And eventually those urges will die off and they'll be replaced with interest of looking at what is this stuff that I've never really seen before. Oh, this is interesting. Let me look and see what they're selling here. And so I would ask, what are some of the things that you can do to distract yourself? And lastly, let's talk a little bit about just sometimes we just have to endure. There are certain situations that we can't distract from or that we can't escape from or that we can't avoid. I just got to figure out how do I endure it. But there are some ways that we can kind of extrapolate that out. And one of those things is to talk it through. So if I'm in that moment, maybe I talk it through with somebody that is one of my go-to people when I'm struggling, and just kind of have the conversation. It's like, oh, I'm really struggling with this moment right here, right now. And just kind of talk it through. And a lot of times just by talking it through, it loses some of its power. In a similar one, it's just ask for help, right? So again, that phone can feel pretty heavy sometimes, but learning how to do that, just ask for help. Hey, I'm struggling right now. Can you got a minute? What do you think? Next is to wait it out. And sometimes it's just, I gotta sit in it. It sucks, but I know that eventually this will pass. Although again, it may not feel like it, but it will pass. And I just need to kind of ride it out. Again, it's that concept of riding the wave of emotions out. So it's going to come, it's going to crest, and then it's going to drop. And lastly, one of the strategies for being able to endure is to take some protection. And it kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, is have somebody that I know is going to be there for me and support me. And again, if this is one of those situations, for some people, maybe they've got to go to court and they can't really avoid that. They need to go and do that. So bring somebody with you that can be there to help support you as you try to clean up some of that past. The second type of trigger I want to talk about are the internal triggers. And generally they're similar to the external, except in these you can't avoid them, right? So my internal voice, that internal critical voice or diction voice or whatever you want to call it, is creating some turmoil for me. And so I've got to figure out, how do I address that? How do I deal with that voice and not let it convince me that somehow drinking is going to be the option or the opportunity for this? And again, distraction works for internal triggers as well. So can I distract myself when that internal voice says, hey, let's go drink? Again, I need to distract myself from that, not let it seep in and take ground, but cut it off. The second's going to be letting go. So with letting go, it's just kind of recognizing what it is and accepting. Again, it's some of that radical acceptance, which is all radical means in this case is that the total acceptance that this is the reality, this is the truth, and not be afraid of it. But what it does require is that I do have some sort of backup thought to this. So that voice comes in and says, we could go drink, and it's, again, radical acceptance is, well, yes, I could drink, but here's my truth, here's my reality. If I do drink, here are the consequences that are going to follow that. And so it's again the concept of, I'm not responsible for my first thought, but I am responsible for my second and my third. How am I going to address that internal trigger that's going on? Can I challenge it? Can I do some thought stopping techniques and not let it kind of gin itself up to the point where I am now on that gerbil wheel and it is just spinning at high speed. I need to stop that initially when it first steps in. And lastly, sometimes it's enduring it. I say that, but again, I'm going to challenge that, Part of what I can do is I can reach out to somebody, so I'm not enduring it alone. There's situations that occur and they're just going to last for a little bit. The emotions may be heightened because of this experience. And so, again, that's more of an internal piece. And so I need to reach out, talk with someone, again, challenge the thought, walk that through. Don't let it just sit there and fester. Again, ask for help. Hey, I'm struggling now. You got a few minutes. Let me tell you what's going on. And lastly, it's again just kind of wait it out, understanding that feelings aren't facts, although it feels like that this is ultimately the truth. It isn't. I don't have to drink. There's no reason for me to drink, although the voice inside, that critical voice is telling me, well, I can help you with these emotions. I can help them go away. Well, yes, initially they will go away, but they will be back, and they will be back in full force as soon as I sober up. And most likely I've probably added to the consequence list, which is something I certainly don't want to do. So tell me what you think. I'd be interested in what coping strategies you deal with and how you work through them. These become basic tools in our toolkit, as they say, but they really are important throughout recovery. And I'm going to have to deal with life, and that's just part of it. And as I get older, coping strategies, they become a little bit more sophisticated. I would say initially, early on, one of my primary coping strategies, which we didn't talk about, was just replacement. Because alcohol is whenever I was feeling emotion, alcohol would replace it. I'd use alcohol to address that emotion, and so I would replace it with alcohol. If I was feeling bored, I would replace it with alcohol. So when I got sober, again, I think replacement's kind of a combination of a lot of those, but what I'm looking to do is just replace that idea or that thought of drinking by either, again, talking to somebody, finding something else to do, making sure my day is full of activities and things for me to do becomes important. So coping strategies take effort, they take work. From my perspective, they will atrophy if you don't use them. So, they evolve, they grow. As you use them, they become stronger. But much like a muscle, if I don't use them, then they atrophy, they get weak. And what happened for me is I started drinking at a relatively young age, at 13, 14 years of age, and alcohol became a coping strategy. It was a way I just kind of dealt with having fun or whatever that was. Eventually, by 16, 17, I was using it regularly, and it became a primary coping strategy. It was now helping me deal with my emotions beyond just fun, if I was sad or if I was bored or any of those other things. And then eventually it became kind of my only coping strategy. It's just the way I dealt with life. And so when I got sober, my coping strategies hadn't matured. So I was dealing with life as a 14-year-old. And, I was acting like a 14-year-old because I couldn't manage life in a way, because I didn't have those coping strategies. I didn't have that way to deal with life. And so I had to grow those up in a hurry. I had to figure out, how do I deal with life? So I started working on these coping strategies, learning how to avoid this idea of drinking. One of the biggest ones was learning how to just to accept that life was going to do what life was going to do, and I really didn't have any control over it. And I had to come to some sort of just recognition that was just how it is. And then I needed to learn how to address my emotions. Learning how to regulate my emotions and deal with them became really important as I got sober. So tell me what you think about your coping strategies, kind of where you're at, or maybe a direction that you feel like you could work on them more, or where's a blind spot for you. If you're interested, I would encourage you to go back and watch the episode before this, which kind of addressed relapse and cravings, because this one kind of fits with that, and how do I address those things. In the upcoming videos, we'll talk about some of the slogans and jargons that we see as coping strategies in some of the recovery programs, and what do they mean, and how can I implement those as I move forward with my day-to-day. And I still use them. I'm 30-something years sober, and I still use some of those slogans to remind myself I need to pump the brakes sometimes and just kind of relax and let life unfold. I'm super excited that you guys are here and that you hung out to the end of this video. And I hope you guys have an awesome day, and we'll talk to you next time. Be safe.